This is a farmhouse with a cluster of flies, and this time of year is bad. We are so very sorry, there is little we can do. She didn't beg or not enough. She didn't stay when things got tough. I told a lie, she got mad. She wasn't there when things got bad. I never ever saw the northern lights. Never really heard a cluster of flies. Never ever saw the stars so bright. And in the farmhouse it's be alright, 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 alright. Woke this morning to a steaming lash. Every man rise from the ash. Each betrayal begins with trust. Every man returns to dust. Don't ever saw the northern lights. Never really heard a cluster of flies. Never ever saw the stars so bright. In the farmhouse it's be alright, 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 alright. Summer in Utah Wells was reported missing June 15th, 2021 around 6:30 p.m. when her father called in and advised that her mother had went for a walk or a run, and when she came back, she could not find Summer. It's been reported that one of Summer's brothers last saw her walking away from her home. We don't know exactly what time of day that was, and it's also been reported by Summer's parents themselves that Summer's brothers last saw her walking down to the basement to play with her toys. So there's a slight discrepancy there. Summer was reportedly last seen wearing a gray pants and a pink shirt, and she was believed to be barefoot. Summer has blonde hair and blue eyes. Her head was shaved at the time of her disappearance. She was reported as 3 feet tall, though she's likely 3.5 to 4 feet tall by now. And she was reported as 40 pounds, which is very thin. And she was very thin. So if anyone has any information regarding Summer's whereabouts, 1-800 TBI FIND or tips to TBI@tn.gov. So this is not specifically about Summer or her case per se. It's a recap of most of the live Dudley and Don were on, and a lot of things that I have to say in between. They were on together at Voices Behind the Wall on May 20th, 2021. Dudley says he first met Don in 2005. He said Don just had his first son out of his 4 that he has with Candace, which doesn't make sense because that's nearly 20 years ago. So he must be mistaken on when he really met Don. Maybe he's bad with time because it seems like a curse in this case. Dudley says he moved up to Tennessee from Louisiana because of Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was late August of 2005, so it would have been sometime later in the year. Dudley says they were all doing drugs back then, and Don had a coke problem. We've heard Don admit that he had a coke problem in his past. When Don comes on panel, he's mad, but he holds it together. He raises his voice to say that Dudley was full of it because he only worked with Don 2 whole days back then and he didn't do any coke with him. All right, so trigger warning throughout all of this because there's a lot of sensitive things discussed and a lot of things that definitely shouldn't be talked about in front of any children. So I'm just going to throw out general blanket like language and trigger warning through this whole thing, okay? So I'm assuming Don means him and Dudley only worked together 2 days back in 2005 when they first met. Then they didn't work together for some extended period of time until they both worked for Tucker's drywall business. Don says the first day he met Dudley, Richard Tucker brought him to the job and Don worked with Dudley till 11 a.m. So Richard Tucker brought Dudley in and they worked together until 11 a.m. Don said he didn't like working with Dudley, so he was going to have to figure something out. So right away, it seems like Don and Dudley didn't care for each other and for whatever reason, butted heads from the time they met. The second day, Don told Dudley he can't work with him anymore. Don says he never did any coke with Dudley and tells him to quit lying, and he says he doesn't even know Dudley. I think Don knew Dudley a lot more than he is portraying because they did spend a lot of time together, and regardless of whether they were at work or not, it's a job where you can easily converse and get to know each other pretty quickly. So, yeah. Um it's so unclear to me how long anybody has actually known each other in this case, but it seems like it comes out a lot that people have known each other for years with a lot of these people. They're all intertwined in some way, it seems. I get, in local areas, like especially in areas where it's more remote, um, there tends to be a lot less people, so people tend to know each other a lot more. So I get that. It's just interesting. Don says he doesn't hang with Dudley and didn't say anything like that to him. People speculate that Don and Dudley did in fact hang out based on the fact that Dudley's yellow Xterra was parked in Don's driveway just a couple of weeks before Summer was reported missing during the filming of the Summer Dancing in the Rain in front of the red for sale barrel. Apparently, that was Candace filming, and Don and Dudley rode together to work that day, and that's where they were at the time of the filming. Dudley verifies it was only 2 days that he worked with Don back in the day, and Dudley says that's all you need, as in that's all you need is a couple days to get to know someone. So apparently did they work for Tucker the first time as well? Dudley says he never said Don did coke with him. He said they all did drugs, and Don had a coke problem. Don has admitted to everyone in his past that he used to be on coke really bad, and that he always wants to do it when he drinks. We know he drinks a lot, so who knows if he's still doing it to this day. It wouldn't surprise me. Does it mean he did something awful to Summer? No, but I think it's important to note. But Don said he wasn't doing it, that Dudley might have been, but he wasn't. Cher asks how long they worked together. Don says he didn't know him, worked 2 half days with him, that's it. Then Don and Dudley talk about all the names of all the people they worked with through Tucker. Dudley says Don threw a lot of heat on him for whatever reason, and he didn't pay him his money. Don said that's another lie. Don says yes, he did pay Dudley, and Dudley says no, he didn't. I don't know why Dudley would confront Don about money that he owes him for work that he did if it wasn't true. But then again, he drops the subject pretty quickly, so maybe he owed him for something else, or there's something else to it that he doesn't want to talk about, so he figured, let's just drop it. Who knows? Cher is trying to get them to talk nicely to each other. Again, I don't see why Dudley would lie about Don ripping him off a specific amount of money, but stranger things happen every day. Don says he paid Dudley every dime that he owed him. I just have a gut feeling that Don probably does owe Dudley money for work he did or for something, and Don probably knows Dudley has no way to prove it. Um, but I feel like also there's something more to it that maybe Dudley doesn't want revealed, which you'll hear what that is in a little bit. Dudley says, I wish I could get in front of you because I promise you I would have known you for, if I would have known you for the way you are, I promise you. Don says, I wish so too. So Dudley's saying he wishes he would have been able to stand in front of Don, to like beat him up pretty much. They're talking over each other a little bit, and it's hard to understand exactly what's being said. Cher asks Don if he paid him all that he owed him, and Don says, yeah. Dudley calls him out and says, $300, dude? Come on, I was supposed to have a $1,500 check that week. Then Dudley is the one that wants to drop the conversation right then and there. He doesn't want to argue about it, he says. Then Cher asks about the day Don was acting funny at work right before Summer was reported missing. Dudley said they were working together for almost 2 months. Dudley says the first time I met him, Don said he had to stay at work late because CPS was going to be coming to their house and Don was trying to avoid them. Dudley said that's what Don told him. Don says, yeah, okay, I might have said that. I might not have wanted to talk to them or whatever. Why would Don not want to talk to CPS? There was a reason he was avoiding them, and I'm curious. Why? Was Don not supposed to be at the house? I really don't think there would be any way for anybody to know that unless Don or Candace said it themselves, which I've not heard. Was he unable to pass a drug test? Was that the problem? I mean, why would he avoid CPS at his own house? You gotta wonder about these things. He portrays himself having a lovely day and talking to CPS just fine on the 14th, so why was he avoiding them prior to that? Don says someone called CPS and said he was giving the kids loaded guns to play with, of all things. Don says that was their first case and it was dropped June 14th. Maybe they do things differently in Hawkins County, but I know in most places, CPS cases are closed in office and signed off on, and then there is then a letter mailed to the parents informing them of CPS's decision to close their investigation. So maybe Don meant they told him everything was looking good or whatever, and they were going to close the case, but maybe it wasn't actually official yet. Who knows? There's really no way for us to know that for sure. Don said welfare came to his house with a supervisor. Don said the kids were running around with their motorcycles, and it was really nice, a beautiful day. Don said then the very next day is when Summer came up missing on June 15th, 2021. I wonder if Don and Candace celebrated when their case was closed, and was it maybe a long late night on the 14th? That would be very good information to know if Don and Candace had anybody over at their house or went anywhere to get anything or get anyone to bring back to their house. If there was maybe like a little party going on or something, anyone that was around at all, what all you all did, that would be good information because that would give us a closer look at the hours leading up to Summer's disappearance. And I'm not saying they did do that. I'm not saying they did have a party. I'm saying I wonder if they did. It's just a question. Those are some of the most crucial pieces of time to look at. What about the very late night hours of June 14th and the very early morning hours of June 15th? Were they really sleeping all night? Was it a late one? Did they go anywhere? And if so, where was Summer? So Don says Summer came up missing the very next day after their case was closed. And Dudley says, yeah, and then you blamed me. Don says, I'm not blaming you for it. Dudley said, but you did blame me, bro. Which Don did blame Dudley right off the bat and even said Candace didn't like the way he was looking at Summer. So, something keeps beeping. I'm sorry, I gotta go check what it is. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. So Don says Summer came up missing the very next day after their case was closed. And Dudley says, yeah, and then you blamed me. Don said, I'm not blaming you for it. Dudley said, but you did blame me, bro. Which Don did blame Dudley right off the bat and even said Candace didn't like the way he was looking at Summer, which is a pretty big accusation, and that got Dudley a lot of hate and might have caused him some actual problems. But Don also says Dudley has an alibi. Don says, I was looking at everybody, and yeah, you was my number one suspect, Don said. Dudley says, you blamed me hard. You said I was your main suspect. Don said you were because you were so freaking mad at me. You had a hate for me. Dudley said he was mad at Don because he didn't pay him all the money he owes him, for one. Dudley says he isn't going to argue with Don. That's where Dudley drops it about the money Don owes him. That made me kind of wonder because if Don really owed him that much money, you'd think considering everything else Dudley chooses to argue with him about, that he would definitely argue about some bills, right? I'm not throwing shade at Dudley or saying Don doesn't owe him money. He probably does. But maybe it was for something else, like I said, or there's more to it that Dudley doesn't want to talk about or something. Cher asks if Dudley would still have problems with Don even if he did pay him what he owed him. Dudley says Don has multiple personalities. Interesting answer, but okay. Dudley says Don does stuff to mess with my head all day. He will tell you to do something, then yell at you for doing it. He drives you nuts. He says he goes home to his wife and complains to her and she even gets sick of hearing it about Don. I don't know if it's true for sure, but I'm pretty sure they split up because he refers to her as his ex-wife. So Cher explains to Dudley that Don and Candace have pointed fingers at everybody, not just him. I think Dudley can see that probably, but he was so upset because Don, right out the gate, came at Dudley for making his daughter disappear, and Dudley thinks Don is responsible. So to him, it's probably an extra hard slap in the face because he probably knows that Don knows Dudley wouldn't take Summer. And if he did, she would have been found, in my opinion. Cher asked Dudley if it was his daughter, wouldn't he blame Don? Dudley said he wouldn't blame anyone for something he doesn't have proof of. I think that's a good answer. Dudley said Don had no proof of him, he just wanted to fire Dudley the next day when he threw mud all over the wall and said Dudley did it. I don't understand his wording sometimes. Summer wasn't missing before Dudley was fired. I just didn't understand that sentence. He said, Dudley said Don had no proof of him, like as in Don had no proof of Dudley taking Summer. He just wanted to fire him the next day when he threw mud all over the wall and said Dudley did it. That doesn't make sense because Summer wasn't missing at that point, so why would he say that? Anyways, Dudley asked Don if he remembers that, about flipping mud all over the wall, about flinging the mud everywhere. Don said he doesn't even know what Dudley is talking about. That's probably what I would say too if I did it. I'm just kidding, but seriously. Cher asks, was there a BB gun fight on the 14th? Don ignores her. He asks Dudley if he was high on meth on the day he was fired. Dudley says, the day I was fired? No. Dudley says, the day I was fired, I was effed off because you fired me and you trashed that house. Dudley says, what about the weekend you were supposed to work with me and I put 5 buckets of mud up that day and you didn't even come in on Sunday? Then Monday, you're sitting on the edge of the tub like you just lost your best friend. Dudley asks, did you bury her in the wall at that house? Don says, wow. Dudley says, I'm wondering. That was private property. Don says, I'm not going to sit here and accuse you like that. Dudley says, you did enough accusing me. Don says, I know you was high on meth. And Dudley says, dude, you were high on that. They both deny it. I bet they were both high. Does it really matter what it was on, coke or the other stuff? Kinda, because that could boil down to who they got it from, etc. People they associate with. Yeah, so it kind of does matter. Don says, I don't do that stuff. Dudley says, please. The old lady was doing it with the kids there. I saw it on the plate with the hot rails in the house. Come on, Don. Don starts laughing, and Candace says something in the background. She says, if you do that stuff, you wouldn't be as fat as you are. Also, he probably wouldn't know what a hot rail was unless he did that stuff. Just saying. Cher asks if Dudley reported it then, since he saw it. Dudley says he told TBI a couple days later when they talked to him. Dudley says this happened a couple days after he got his check, so that's his last check when Don gave him the $300, and since then he hasn't ever paid him the rest of what he worked for? Or was that a check for something else? He says his wife said, don't ever bring me there again. What specifically caused her to be so afraid or so on guard up on that hill that she never wanted to go back? Must have been something pretty drastic, because I believe her. Unless she's just hating on them for some reason, maybe she's mad that Don didn't pay her husband or now ex-husband the money that he owed him, but I doubt it. There's probably a reason. Cher says, so you're saying you witnessed this happen, right? With the stuff on the plate and the hot rails. Dudley says, I witnessed the plate and the dope on the plate. Cher asks, did you call CPS that day? Dudley says, no. Cher asks, if you saw them do that, why did you not call CPS? Dudley says the kids were not right there in the same room. Cher says, but having a plate at all in the house, don't you think you should have called CPS? Excuse me. Dudley says, yeah, I should have called them. I was messed up too. I was dealing with Don every day. I don't see how dealing with Don every day has anything to do with him calling CPS, because they wouldn't tell Don that he was the one that called. So, but maybe that's what he was worried about. If Dudley really did see drugs like that around Summer and her brothers, and Don and Candace were really that messed up, and he didn't call CPS or report it to the authorities, and Summer being missing has something to do with drugs, there's probably going to be a lot of people pretty upset with Dudley. Just saying. That's probably something he should have said to Don privately. And can we even really take his word for 100? No. He could just be mad and spiteful towards Don and lying on him. But if these things are true, he is making himself look bad too, in my opinion. We all want honesty, but don't say things just to make people look bad. Include the whole context. Were you getting high there? Is that how you really know that? Don says that's a good excuse. Dudley says, I guess you're on somas if you're doing that. which Soma's is a muscle relaxer, so I really don't know why he said that. Probably because a lot of people use medications like muscle relaxers to come down from stimulant drugs. Again, how would he know that unless he was doing it or around people doing it enough to where he knew what they were doing? No hate, just trying to get a read on the dude, which is hard to do through a YouTube video. But needless to say, Don says if I can get away with doing 90 miles per hour on the back roads and get to work faster, I'm going to do it. Dudley says, you try to lose me every time. Now, I don't understand why Don randomly said that. Maybe he misheard something Dudley said. Maybe I'm missing something. Who knows? Maybe he was reading the chat or something. Cher asks, so was there a BB gun fight on June 14th? Dudley says maybe a finishing gun nail fight. Okay. Candace is yelling in the background something to Cher, something about trying to type in the chat. Candace talks a lot through the end of this call, and she's in the background just talking and talking, and it sounds like she's talking to Cher in the chat and Don and Dudley, but nobody can actually really hear exactly what she's saying for the most part, and she's talking over everybody but in the background, and she kind of sounded a little drunk or high on something to me, but that's just an observation. Cher pointed out that she didn't think they were under the influence, but I thought they kind of sounded like they were, but you can make your own mind up on that. Does it even matter? Well, maybe it might, in my opinion. It kind of does build a profile for them and what their priorities are in life, considering everything that has gone on in their lives in the past couple of years. The decision to continually get drunk and high is a bad choice, in my opinion, and we should be looking at the lifestyle choices of Summer's parents because she is the victim and her parents are suspects in her disappearance. Not saying they're the only ones, but they are suspects. So yeah, their behavior matters. Dudley says this is crazy. Mark asks if Dudley can tell them about his day on June 15th. Dudley says that was the day I got fired. Don says no, you got fired the 14th. Dudley says you got to remind me I smoke a lot of weed. What's interesting to me about that statement is weed tends to make people work more diligently, in my experience, and to remember things more vividly in many cases. So to say remind you because you smoke a lot of weed doesn't make sense to me personally, because it actually makes the mind more aware, in my opinion, for most people. But anyways, that's a little besides the point. So it was the day before Summer went missing. Dudley says Tuesday was the day she came up missing, right? Monday was the day I got fired. Don says, yeah, something like that. Dudley says, I got a phone call. I think it was 3 a.m. My dad called me saying the Stadies were at his house looking for Dudley. They were looking all through the house for Dudley because Don sent them over there and said he kidnapped Summer. God knows what happened because he fired me and I did something at work, which he had done. And then Mark interrupts. So Dudley was saying, God knows what happened because he fired me and I did something at work, which he had done. And then that's when Mark interrupts, and which I really wish he wouldn't have. Dang it. I was so confused by what Dudley was starting to say, and he never clarified. And I was curious what he was going to say there. Mark says, so that would have been Wednesday morning at 3 a.m., right? Dudley says, yeah. They talk about that a couple different times, and Dudley seems unsure whether it was the 14th or 15th or actually the 16th because it was 3 a.m. It would have been Wednesday the 16th at 3 a.m. There's lots of talking over each other, and it makes it hard to understand what everyone's trying to say, and nobody gets out what they were trying to say for a minute. Dudley says, I seen what you all did, bro. That was really some messed up shit. Don says, I think you're lying. I know you're lying. Dudley says, ask me. She was drinking all the time. She wasn't a perfect mother. Cher says, Dudley, I sense a lot of anger. Dudley says, I'm sorry. It's the first time. Cher says she thinks him and Don should talk. They're talking over each other a bit again. Don says, Candace never drank around you. Dudley says, you're crazy. Don't lie to me, bro. You're lying to yourself. Don't lie to me. Don says, she does have an alcohol problem. Dudley says, yeah, don't preach to the choir. You don't gotta bullshit me. Dudley says, I'm honest, bro. You asked if I did METH, and I didn't do it that day. I did it Saturday when you wasn't there. Sorry, I don't want to say that word too much. Don says, you was all doped out. They bicker over each other. Dudley says, whatever, bro. I ain't worried about you. Don says, I ain't worried about your ass either. Dudley says, well, good. Bring yours up here and let's handle it. Don says, that wouldn't be no problem. Don says, I will meet up with you someday. Don't think I won't. Dudley says, I promise you will run. Cher breaks it up. They were both getting heated. Don says, we'll handle it. Cher says, there's nothing to handle. Dudley, are you cleared? Dudley says, I was cleared, pal. TBI cleared me. Dudley says, I haven't talked to them in a while. Cher says, can TBI say that or any law enforcement? Cher asks, who told you you were cleared? Dudley says, I talked to them personally. Cher says, you do know the law can lie to you, right? Dudley says, I do. Cher says, so I don't understand why you would be angry to be pinned as a top suspect in this. I personally understand why he would be angry because that probably really sucked for him to have Summer's disappearance initially blamed on him by Summer's dad publicly. Cher says, I also understand why Don and Candace are upset as well. And I can see why both of you are upset with each other. Dudley says, yeah, he ripped me off. So here Dudley brings it up again about the money Don owes him. So maybe he's not trying to not talk about it too much in detail, or he wouldn't keep bringing it up. I don't know. It's just something seems off to me about that money Don owes him. And I'm probably thinking too hard about it, but it bothers me that I feel like it could have been money for something different than him working, or there's just something that he's leaving out. Which actually we end up kind of finding out what that is, I think, here in a minute. So maybe they share the same dealer, who knows? Cher says, but this was 2 years ago now. Don says, you ripped yourself off, man. Don says, Dudley didn't do nothing right. And what you're talking about, what I did on the walls, I went on YouTube and I looked up everything about how people on METH act. I wrote every single one of those things down on the wall. Hyperactive, I can't remember them all, and you fit every single description. Dudley says, I ain't even from here. I talk different, I act different, and I am hyperactive. Don says, I don't think you're on anything right now. Dudley says, no, I'm not. I smoked a joint, that's about it. Don says, well, good, keep it that way. I don't want to see anybody go down on that stuff, man, it's bad. Don says, he has his weaknesses, but that stuff is not one of them. Dudley says, I'm not even here to talk about that. I will answer whatever I need to, though. I'm guilty for what I've done, but I know what I didn't do. I will say, though, props to Dudley for finally being open about his drug use, because he did initially deny it, and at least he's being honest, right? And I believe he's currently dealing with the repercussions of that. Cher asks what could get you to on a civil path that maybe Dudley interrupts and says no. Cher asks why. Dudley says, after what I dealt with working with him and begging Jesse, please give me my own house, take me away from him, and it didn't happen, and I got thrown into the whole missing, kidnapped, killing, whatever it was with his girl. Dudley says, I heard a lot. I heard a lot. Sometimes it's better to just agree to disagree and not talk at all, you know? I think Don and Dudley might have something they could work out over a private call and call it a day. But here on YouTube, with all these people watching, it's going to be dragged out, and it's probably going to get blown out of proportion. And there's a certain hype to it all, in my opinion, because it's on YouTube, and it all probably has nothing to do with Summer being missing. But if Summer being missing has anything to do with drugs, then maybe there's a chance. But I doubt it, but it could. I think it just goes to speak for their character of both Don and Dudley. Cher says, well, we've all heard a lot. I know that's the truth. Mark says, so you were fired on the 14th, so the next day, tell me about your day. Dudley says, I went to go work on my vehicle, which had broke down. And Don says, and the police are aware of that. And Dudley says, yeah, because I was actually on camera. Cher asks Don if that makes him feel relieved of Dudley being a suspect. Don says, well, yeah, because I talked to the police and they told him Dudley has an alibi. Dudley says this is the first time him and Don have had a conversation since Don dropped that $300 off to him. So when Dudley says he went over to Don's to get a check right before Summer went missing, what was that check for? Dudley says, he brought me $300, but I was supposed to make over $1,200 that week. So Don still owes Dudley, what, $900 allegedly? That's a lot of money. Dudley says he did 3 houses and he worked his ass off Saturday, which is the day he was supposedly on the drugs, according to his own words. And Don didn't even show up Sunday. And then Monday, he's sitting on the tub. That was the 14th. That's the day Dudley walked in and that mud that was still left was still sitting there. He was sitting on the tub in the bathroom and he looked like he just lost his best friend. He looked like he was crying, so I didn't really know. I had never seen him that way before. That was before I knew his little girl was missing. Again, Dudley making it sound like Summer went missing before the 15th. She wasn't missing yet, Dudley, not according to the Amber Alert. She went missing the 15th around 6 p.m., so you wouldn't have known she was missing yet. Dudley says something about Don hauling ass in his truck. Don, did the law tell you that Dudley was cleared? Don says nobody has been cleared, and they made that clear. But they did say he had an alibi. Cher asks, not even Jody Sue? Don says, I really doubt that. I remember hearing Detective Pruitt say those actual words, Jody Sue is not a suspect. And I know law enforcement can lie, but I did hear him say that. That seriously leads me to believe that she's not a suspect. Could still have guilty knowledge. We don't know. But I think the law has reason to believe Jody is not a suspect, or they wouldn't have said that. Don says she was down there when Summer disappeared, meaning down at the creek, I'm assuming. Mark asked Don about when he was sitting on the side of the tub looking like he was really sad or upset about something. What was that all about? Don says, I was probably trying to figure out what to do with Dudley. Don would have been that upset about firing someone he argued with constantly and they couldn't stand each other? Would he really be that upset? Why would it be that hard? So hard that Don looked like he just lost his best friend and looked like he was crying. Why would he look all sad? Not gonna lie, that's a red flag to me. Don had a really bad excuse there. I don't believe that one at all. Don says, I wish I could remember what I wrote down about all the ways people act when they're on the M word. You can imagine someone that's normal getting on that stuff and they can't do their job. They're combative in every way. Don says it was a fight with Dudley every day. Don says when you finish drywall, it's a process. Dudley wasn't willing to follow the process. He just wanted to do it his own way. It was bad. It was really bad with him. I don't know what was going on in his mind, but being on that stuff, he probably hadn't slept in 2 or 3 days. It wasn't good, him trying to finish drywall. Now, just because Don is saying all of this about Dudley, take it with a grain of salt, okay? Because Dudley said they were all using drugs together. So it was probably a shit show up in there with Tucker Drywall, and it's probably not Tucker's fault, I'm sure, but there was obviously some things going on within his business involving drugs, Don and Dudley, and who knows who else, and he may or may not know about it. Don says, I don't know if you all seen the video on YouTube of the spider on that stuff. It couldn't even build a web, it's kind of like that. I can't have that. I can't have it around me. I definitely can't have it on the job. Fair enough, if it's true. But I do have to wonder if it was more of a stepping on your toes type of situation, impeding on you getting high when you wanted to and do what you wanted to do when you were at work without him being there to hinder that, maybe. I don't know. I do wonder how many others there at Tucker were getting high with them on the job. And I wonder if Summer was ever around the job when any of that was going on, because it seems like Don took Summer there a lot. Don says Dudley wasn't willing to work with him. He just went into the house and made a mess. But the thing that got me, he was yelling and screaming at me to leave. He was really upset. He said to just leave. He left and Don kept working. Don says he wasn't in a very good state of mind at all. Don says it's horrible what that stuff does. I have to think Don probably knows from firsthand experience, either from doing it himself or from Candace doing it. I don't believe that Don had to YouTube that stuff and the effects that it has on people. That was and always will be a red flag to me, because it feels like Don is trying to protect the fact that he knows what someone on that stuff feels like, because he was probably doing it and or selling it. And again, it could have had something to do with Summer's disappearance, or maybe not at all, but it does get brought up a lot. And there's a reason Don is so extra about hiding the fact that he knows what the effects of that stuff is. Cher asks, what time did you guys leave the job site on June 14th? Don says, well, Richard was there making fun of me for putting all my brand new tools in the car. I think he meant for putting all his tools in the brand new car. Cher asks, did the law tell you at all they don't think it's Dudley? Don says, well, they said he has an alibi that he was working on his truck. Cher says, so on that day, you would have had to drag Dudley back to your house to get him to his car because you guys rode together that day, right? Don says, I think he had his wife's Suburban that day. I don't know what he was driving that day, but he had a car. Cher asks, that yellow vehicle? Don says, yeah, it could have been that Xterra. The day Dudley's yellow Xterra was filmed there was weeks prior, but that doesn't mean he wasn't there since. Dudley says he was driving his black GMC Denali because his Xterra was broken down. He says that's what he was fixing the next day, meaning the day Summer was reported missing. And Don thought he was tweaking that day. Don says it was his opinion he was tweaking and coming down. Don says the fact that he got on that stuff and he started imagining stuff in his mind. I've been around it and I've seen people act like that. It's crazy. It makes them nuts. So Don did see Dudley on June 15th because he says the day he paid him was after Summer went missing. So did he see him on the 15th, and why? So why would he say he thought Dudley was tweaking on the 15th, but then he said he didn't see him that day? That's confusing. Don says Dudley didn't help him finish the house, so he didn't get paid for the whole house. Dudley says, as hard as it was to get along with you, you saw how our work together was so good. He said he would brag on Dudley and tell him he was a natural, but he talked shit to Jesse and Richard Tucker. He said because Don was jealous and wanted him gone because he was making Don look bad, even though their work together was so good. Dudley says after working with Don, he's had some effed up thoughts about Don in relation to Summer's disappearance. Dudley says the day that Don brought Dudley his money, he says Don was sitting there with his son and Don straight up told him, you killed my daughter, then gave him $300. Don says Dudley kidnapped Summer or killed her. Wow. Don says he has never said anything like that. It's a straight lie. Candace is in the background saying Dudley is a liar and a fake. Dudley says, okay, what about the 50 buckets of mud in the yard that you moved before the police came? Candace says Dudley has never seen me drink. He is a liar when he says that. I'd be more worried about him saying that Don said that he killed Summer. That Don said Dudley killed Summer. Wow. So who knows if that's really true. Again, obviously one of them is lying. I don't see why it would be said by Don, and I don't see why Dudley would make it up. Wow. So Dudley says he's seen Candace drinking on YouTube, but he made it sound like he saw Candace drinking all the time when he was over there, which made me curious because supposedly he hasn't been over there very much. So that makes sense. It's because he's seen it on YouTube. Maybe they were on something else, who knows? And maybe he thought they were drinking. I don't know. Dudley says, what does it have to do with Summer? Where is Summer? Now, this is skipping around a little bit, skipping over some loud, argumentative parts to what stood out to me. Cher asked Dudley if he still thinks they're suspects after sitting here and talking to them on panel and after all this time and watching everything on YouTube, because he says his friends and family tells him everything that happens in Summer's case on YouTube, and he probably watches and listens to a lot on his own too. And Dudley says he thinks Don and Candace are prime suspects, and he will stand behind that because that's how he feels. This is around the hour and a half mark, and there is still an hour of talking after this point. It's not all of Don and Dudley, but there is still about an hour of talking between different people for, yeah, if you want to watch that, it's titled... So yeah, it's about the hour and a half mark, and it's titled "A Meeting with Donald Wells and Dudley Ajan. Tempers Run High, as do emotions. Where is Summer Wells?" And it was streamed May 20th, 2021 on Voices Behind the Wall.
So we're almost coming up for the 2-year mark. What would you guys say if anyone's listening now? Your daughter's still missing. What do we say today to these people or person?
I don't know. You mean to the abductor?
The abductor or abductors, yeah. Whoever did whatever.
I don't know what to say. I'd say, it's scary. It's so scary to even because what if Summer is still with this person?
Okay, so what if she can hear you right now talking right now? What would you say?
I love her.
Summer can hear you right now, maybe.
Love her with all my heart, and I'll never stop loving her. Her mother won't either. Her mother and me will love her forever. No, they're talking shit on my cousin. But as far as
I don't know if Candace said that she would off herself for Summer, but that's what it sounded like she said in the background. But I could be totally wrong on that. That's just what I heard. Again, they want to tell Summer that they love her if she can hear it. They aren't saying, we're looking for you, baby girl, and we're not going to stop until we find you. Nothing like that. It's just another disingenuous, we love you, baby girl, in my opinion. Like I say, all the time, I could be totally wrong, but that's just how I feel.
far as the abductor, just please let my daughter come home. Let her have a free life. Let her go to school. Let her get her driver's license. Let her fall in love someday with somebody she actually loves. Don't be this way. Don't hold somebody in bondage. That's not right.
I just wanted to point out that Candace in the background, as they are supposed to be telling Summer, talking directly to Summer, if she were to be able to hear this, what would you say to her? And Candace is in the background talking, swearing about, don't talk about my cousin, and getting all mad and defensive about some things people are saying allegedly about her cousin that I don't think they were actually saying anything bad, but I could be wrong. That was sad to me, and it stood out to me that Candace didn't really have anything to say to Summer, because I'm pretty sure she could hear everything that was going on.
That's not right to do for your own personal pleasure or whatever.
And that's why he did all.
Please just let her come home.
Mm-hmm.
That's what she told Donnie.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was either.
All right.
All right, and again, it was some voices behind the wall. A meeting with Donald Wells and Dudley Ajan. Tempers run high, as do emotions. Where is Summer Wells? Streamed live on May 20th, 2023. So if you want to watch that in its entirety and hear everything that Cher and Killer Looks and whoever else was on panel, if you want to hear what everyone had to say, just head over there and listen to it for yourself. Like I said, there's still a little bit more to this that plays for a little while. Cher and Mark talk for a while after Killer drops off. Don drops off here, right about here, and that's pretty much the entirety of it. So again, Summer Moon Utah Wells went missing June 15th, 2021 was the day she was reported missing. Around 6:30 p.m. when her father called and advised that they could not find her after her mother had went for a walk or run, and they had been hollering for her for about 10 minutes. So that night there was an endangered child alert issued for Summer, and then the very next morning around 11 in the morning, I believe it was, there was an Amber Alert issued because something changed and she was believed to be in imminent danger of bodily harm or death. All it takes is one person to see Summer and one person to say something. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. And continue to check TBI Newsroom for updates on Summer Wells. I know the TBI has unfortunately stated that they have no new updates to share publicly and they are not planning on doing a press release anytime soon. So that was really kind of a blow to hear, to be honest, because I was really looking forward to hearing that there is some kind of movement, but they aren't saying anything. They're just saying that it's still active and ongoing. Clearly, they do have some evidence. They've got to have more than they had on June 15th. They've just got to. I've got to have faith in that. And I hope you all do too. All right. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you taking your time out of your day for Summer Moon Utah Wells. If you know something, if you see something, say something. 1-800-TBI FIND. Tips to TBI at tn.gov. Summer is 7 years old. Let's not go another summer without Summer. If only love alone could save her. All right. Thank you for being here. Again, I really appreciate you all very much.
They thought it could hide our Appalachia princess, but we're here to find you, Appalachia princess. Can't look away, Appalachia princess. Too beautiful to say, Appalachia princess. Can't shut me up, I will be here fighting. Can't brush me off with thunder and lightning. She goes, we follow, not scared of no hollow. We want you to stay, Appalachian princess. But you got gone away, Appalachian princess. We'll figure out a way to get you out of this mess. They thought say Appalachia princess. Appalachia princess.
Keep your crown on straight. It's a tough world out there. Love you guys. Love you, Summer.